Hey guys, we are about to make this dragon loop, and for those of you who don't know, in previous video we created this dragon animation. It's a 3-part tutorial where we model, animate and shade everything. Links are below in the description. So I wanted to follow up with additional part and show you what you can do with it and how easily you can adjust it to create different dragon variations. It's a fully procedural way of work, so we will take it from there and loop it first. We'll do some modeling and shading tweaks, creating simple environment with the particle systems. So let's get into it. Let's loop the dragon first. So select the curve that drives the animation, not the one that we use it to array the body scales, but the other one. To make a loop, we have to close the curve. So if we select one of the end vertices, we can toggle the cyclic with Alt-C. Let's enable Simplify to move this thing freely. Something else we have to take care of. So if we isolate the curve, we can see that we have this sharp end and we want it smooth. So we can go to the active spline and disable the endpoint to make it smooth. This is in the option that closing the curve, you can do it from here. So now we want to adjust the segments to get some interesting looping path. Removing some of the vertices, usually less you have, the smoother the curve will be. To help with the visualization, we can add some depth to the curve for now. We want to keep the dragon in one place, rotating around the center, but leave enough space for the head and the other groups so they don't get into the body when moving. Definitely take some time here. If you're doing changes to the path later, you have to adjust keyframes. If you ask me, I had to do it a few times to get the path right. So check how everything works and let's set the animation. For this one I will change to 300 frames, starting from the first frame. But let's keep it to 0 for now to make it easier for adding the keyframes. Later we will change it to 1, but we wanted to add the keyframes at 0, so we don't have overlapping frames. To create a loop we have to set the same thing at the beginning and at the end, but then offset with 1 frame so we don't have 2 same frames in the final loop, because this will look like there is a glitch. You'll see this in a minute. We can also change the interpolation to linear. Just select everything in the scene with A, then select all the keyframes in the timeline with A again and change the interpolation mode to linear. Let's also go to the preferences and change the default interpolation as well, so when we're adding a new keyframes, they are with linear interpolation. To loop the things, we can start with the head. The empty there is using a follow path constraint, and it's very easy to loop because we have the offset value that we can use. So let's go to the end of the animation and delete the old keyframes. Then add a new keyframe for the constraint offset. Go to the beginning, offset negative or positive, in this case is negative, -100, and add another keyframe. Holding shift and left right arrows we can check if the position is the same. At the end we will change the starting frame to 1 to get rid of one of these duplicating frames and have seamlessly looping animation. But for now let's go back to 0 to make it easier for adding the other keyframes. The next part that we can loop is the body, and this is a little bit tricky because we don't have offset or values that we can use to set it precisely. So we will have to eyeball it and try to get it the same as much as we can. Let's delete old keyframes again. We are at the end of the animation and let's add a location keyframe. We can grab the annotation tool from the tools panel, or just hold down the D key and draw with the left mouse click. The annotation now stays only on the frame that we added it, but we can lock it so it's visible on all frames. If we open the side panel under the View tab, we can lock the annotation to all frames. We can go now to the first frame and offset the body on the x-axis. It has to be locked on the x-axis to slide along the curve. Just eyeball the body to make a full circle and try to put it on the same place to match with the annotation. We can precise the position from the side panel, and let's add another keyframe. check it to see if it's all good. Holding down the D key with the right mouse button to erase the annotation. Moving on to the comp, and it's a similar way, but here we are using an empty to offset the texture on the x-axis. So we have to animate this empty. We have the displace modifier with this circle wood texture, so it won't be hard to loop. Let's first delete the out keyframes, offset the empty a little bit from the center, and add the location keyframe on the end of the animation. And here is where we are using again the annotation to set it right and make it loop. It's not precise, I mean there are not values that we can use and stuff like that, so we have to eyeball it and do it as close as possible. Go to the first frame, offset the empty further on the x-axis and try to get this pattern exactly where it was at the end of the animation. Add the location keyframe, checking left right, and it's not perfect, but if we go to the first frame, we can see that it won't be noticeable that much. The legs are quite simple. We have there the follow path constraint, and we can set it precisely like we did with the head. Get rid of the curve depth, and let's go to the constraint settings. Delete the out keyframes. So we already offset the legs from the body. You can offset where you want it to be and add a keyframe. Then go to the beginning and add -100 right there after the offset value, and add the other keyframe. So it make a full circle. Check if everything is okay and do the same with the other legs. We can check what we have and let's see how it loops. Everything is okay and you can save it from time to time. Make sure you have in backup copies. If you want the dragon to move in the other way, you can just switch the segment's direction like that. Also, when you're in edit mode, you can rotate freely the dragon or move the whole thing just like that. But make sure you do it in edit mode, because it will change the origin point position and everything will mess up. We can easily add in more length to the dragon. Just grab the body curve and extend it along the x-axis in edit mode, just like that. Slide the tail as well on the x-axis to match with the new position. We already touched some of this in the previous video, but let me show you how you can add in more depth and adjust the other parts. To do it, grab the body and in edit mode move the scales on the z-axis. Then scale up a little bit. Check what we have and let's adjust the other body parts. Turn off simplify for now to see how it looks with the subdivisions. We can start tweaking this in edit mode, but we can't see how the changes affect the dragon itself, and we have to switch every time between the modes to see the changes. So what we can do here is to display the curve modifiers in edit mode, and this will give us live feedback on how it looks on the dragon. And you know, this shape can be adjusted in any way to get so many different results, so play with it and see what you can get. Let's tweak the tubes in the same way. Display all modifiers in edit mode to make it easier to see how the changes affect the dragon. That's done, and why not changing the comp pattern as well. Previous part we created this mesh that resemble flames, and now we can create something different. The easiest way is to tweak the existing mesh in edit mode. Just delete some of these faces, extrude some, and tweak the vertices to get something different, that's all. You can turn on the subdivision cage if that's easier for you to edit. We can also display the modifiers to see how it looks back on its place while editing. That's the advantage of the procedural modeling, that we can always edit what we have and even create a totally different things from there. So that's done, and let's remove some of the parts that we added before. Instead of deleting, I'll just move them to another collection and hide it from the viewport and rendering. You can name this collection whatever you want, but I found that it's better to move their things and hide them, not deleting them. And that's just something like a backup folder in case we need them later. We can add back some volume to the legs, because without that part they look skinny now. Let's also hide the whiskers there and tweak some of the head parts. Everything is paired to the empty that have constraint, so we can just disable it, and this will bring the head back to its original position in the center of the scene. You can hide the other collection if you want. First I want to make the mouth wide open, so just grab the curve and adjust it in edit mode. Then the mesh inside, back to its place. You can offset the mouth array just like that if you need. Get also the teeth back on their position. Tweak the rotation where needed. Let's also change the look of these horns. It's using cylinder that is arrayed on the curve, and we can replace it with different objects. I will add again cylinder, but with only 6 sides this time. Isolate only these parts to make it easier to work with. Make sure the scale is applied. We're using here the copy attribute, and that's an add-on that you can enable from preferences. This thing right here. So just copy the location and rotation with Ctrl C. Then copy the modifiers, link the materials, and that's the way to replace the object in this curved setup with array. You can get totally different results like that in no time. We can tweak further in this object. Insert these two faces and bridge them. For this menu you have to enable the loop tools add-on from preferences. We get some artifacts, but if we change the angle, we will fix the bevel, just like that. Till and some of the vertices. Make sure this part is in the collection with the other head parts. And pair it to the empty so everything stays together. Unhide the other parts and enable the constraint to bring it back to its position. We can easily make different tail shape by tweaking the mesh in edit mode. That's the other way to get different variations fast. Anything can be still adjusted, it's all procedural or non-destructive, and that's the beauty of this way of work. So do whatever you like, and let's move it with some material adjustments. Grab the body and tweak this shader first. We can make it black and gray, and for this we can play with the color ramp, or just delete this one and add a new color ramp there. Get rid of the metallic effect on this one. Put down the white to light gray color. Reduce the roughness. Add a little bit of coat also. To get this nice reflection surface. We can add a sheen. This is used for clothes or dust material, but we can use it to give some core for reflection to the body. Let's add in a few emission lines pattern by mixing the materials with mix shader node. For this you can use the wave texture with a mapping and coordinates. No triangular add-on is needed for this Ctrl-T shortcut. Plug it to the factor with a core ramp there to control the mix. Bring the bars closer and we can start seeing the pattern, which we can adjust now by touching the wave texture settings to get it the way we want it. We want to make just a few curved lines, nothing fancy, keep it simple. I'm staying with something like this, and if we shift Ctrl click on the core ramp, we can isolate the wave texture setup to see better what we have. So pick the band's direction you like to be on, adjust the bars and the other settings how you want it, and let's connect the second shader. Its emission here need also a core ramp and a layerway node. Everything plug it to the second shader input. Add colors you like and set the bar's position. Let's simplify in the tube's material. We can use only emission this time with the layerway node to get this light to dark gradient around the tubes. Changing the belly material, it can make a totally different appearance even if it's only the colors. For the comp material we have a lot of stuff happening, so let me organize the nodes first to make it easier to understand what we have on this shader. So this node here are making the dots pattern. We can frame them with Ctrl J and label them from the side panel. Get rid of this part, then plug back the nodes together, output to input. It's quite simple actually, only a few patterns created by mixing materials with the mix shader node. We won't using the bump on this one, so just delete it. This is the lines pattern and we can frame and label it as well. Delete and this gradient, so we can use a single color here. Enable the transmission by sliding the weight all the way up. Delete and this BSDF, we will use emission for this wavy lines pattern. So plug the emission there and add a core ramp and a gradient texture with the mappings. Using the UV coordinates here because we want a linear gradient from top to bottom for the comp emission. You might have to unwrap the comp if you didn't already. Add whatever colors you like and play with the bars till you have all of them visible there. Increase in the strength of the emission. Let's switch the texture coordinates to generated. Here I wanted to make the lines bigger and have just a few of them, but I realized that there is some issue with displaying the generated texture coordinates correctly. I went back and forth for a while. I tweaked the scale, I tried a different pants direction, unwrap it and all these things. Then I found that this is because I flattened earlier the mesh on the y-axis. So the generated coordinates using the bounding box of the object, and when the mesh is flattened it can get the right feedback on how to display it. So make sure you have some volume there, just move some of the vertices along the y-axis, and that's how we can get it the way it have to be. Once we set the wave texture settings right, we can change the core ramp interpolation to B-spline, and this will give us this glowing like effect. One more thing is to change the dots coordinates to generated as well, making the dots pattern still. You can leave it on object, but the dots will be shifting, changing their position when moving the dragon, which is cool as well, depends on what you're looking for. We can leave it like that. Here is the whole shader setup if you want to copy it. Continue with some of the head parts materials. Let's grab the mount, removing the metallic, touch the roughness and add a bit of coat. Pick whatever colors you like. You can also look for color profiles on the web if that's your thing. We can link this material to different parts, and if you have to make it single user and adjust the colors. We made these horns golden before, but if we link the materials, make it metallic, and we can tap again to the erase UV to separate the colors like we did in the previous video. So now we have all these colors there. We can also add some emission pattern to the spikes. Simple mix of two materials with a mix shader. Wave texture with the mappings, plug it to the factor. Bring the color ramp bars closer. And let's use the UV coordinates. You can play with the wave texture settings to get different stuff, but don't make it too complicated. I will stay with something like this. So let's also get the emission, color ramp and a layer weight using the facing. Add some colors and that's okay for now. We can check in cycles what we have. Copy the material to the tail. Make it single user to set the colors as we want. We're done with the shading, so let's move on to the other settings. Set the camera light environment and all this stuff. For the camera, we can set the focal length to 100 for this one. Check the position. I'll leave it here because I want the dragon to go outside the frame a little bit. Enable depth of field. A few things are important here, so let's cover them. First one is the distance. If you press E over the value, we can set the distance with the eyedropper like that. If we enable limits, we can see where exactly is the focus. Just make sure when using the eyedropper, you're doing it from the camera viewport. If we do it from the other viewports, it won't work properly, giving you the wrong distance like you can see. The other thing is the f-stop, and let's switch the view to see how this thing works. So the basic is if we lower the f-stop, we can get more blur. The center of the camera limits is in the focus. And if we say this is 1 for example, this part will be in focus and will get more blurred going away from the center. If we set it to 2, we just have doubled up the focus area and so on. We have other ways to set the distance by using object to control it. I will place a 3D cursor there and add an empty for this. Usually I'm using the shortcut with E key to set the distance for still renders, but if it's animation and we want to follow or track something, it's best to use the focus object. When adding the empty as focus object, the camera will use the origin point of that empty to set the distance. So if we were about to use the other empty, the focus would be on different place, keep that in mind. Pair it to the empty with a constraint, so it's follow the head wherever it's going. Lower the f-stop a little bit more. We can add a nice motion tracking to the camera using constraint, track to. If we pick the empty as target and play the animation, we can see how it's targeting the head or the empty that we connected. Now depends on what you want to get, you can leave it like that, but for this scene I think the effect is too strong, so we can lower the influence to limit this effect and have just a slight motion to the camera. I think something like this look well, but you can do whatever you like. And let's move on with the other things. We set the camera, so let's touch the other settings. We can check the dragon on different frames and tune the vertices to precise the movement. How it's rotating along the curve, it's also important, so don't skip this. To adjust the light, we can obviously go to the light properties panel and do it there, but instead of doing this every time, I prefer to use the right click panel. Here at the top you can see the values when we do it. Move left right to adjust it. I will make the sides light smaller and not so strong, and increase the power and the size of the bottom light. Checking on different frames, and maybe add one more light to fill some of the shadows. We can also use point lights instead of area lights. For the environment, we can go to the world settings and enable the volume by adding principal volume there. Lower it a lot to 0.01 or 0.02. Get also an icosphere, we will use it for the particle system. Scale it down and put it on the side. Apply the scale. Add a decimate modifier and put the ratio down to simplify the shape. Have something like this, then duplicate it and tweak it in edit mode to get different shapes. Duplicate it a few more times and adjust them to get something like a few small stones. Convert all to mesh and move them to their own collection. Let's add in material. We will use emission, but if you use object info to get different colors to the objects using one material, it just don't work well with the loop because you will have one set of colors at the beginning and another at the end of the animation. That's why give every particle a different emission color instead of the random thing with the object info. We have this and we can actually hide the collection from the viewport and rendering. Add a cube for the particle system and cover the dragon and the whole scene with the lights and the camera. Go to the particles tab and add a new particle system. Before we cover the things, let's first go down and disable show emitter from rendering and viewport to hide that big cube. So here we have the number or how many particles we want, on which frame they will start and end. We can set both to 0, so we have all these 500 particles there at once, but not popping up gradually. The lifetime is how many frames they will stay before start disappearing. If we go back to the first frame and press play, that's what we have for now. All these particles are spread on the cube faces only, but if we go down to the source, we can change the emit from to volume to spread them inside the cube. To connect the particles that we created earlier, we just have to change the rendering to collection and add them as an instance collection right there below. Check the size and adjust it so they are not too big and not too small. Add in some variation to the scale using the scale randomness values. Enable the rotation and randomize it. If we press play, they're all going down, and that's because we have a gravity. So scroll down, and right here below we have a field weights, where we can disable the gravity just like that. Go back to the first frame to play and see what we have. Now they will all go outwards because we have the velocity. If we set the normal to 0, you can see how they will stay on their place. Let's make them stay longer by increasing the lifetime to 150 frames. We can add some velocity to specific axes. Let's push the Z axis. And randomize them a little bit. You can experiment with all the settings to get something you like. Also, when doing the adjustments, go back to the first frame, then play again the animation to see what you have. If I have to be honest, it can be tricky to set the particle system. Something can be hard to get it right. You can have some issues like adjusting the settings and noting changes or stuff like that. So if you run into these bugs, you can try to delete all bakes, adjust some settings, or even delete the particle system or the whole cube, then Ctrl Z to bring it back. Something like restart, it might help. We can make the particles bigger while setting them up to help with the visualization. We can stay with this setup, and so the way to loop the particle system is very simple. We are just using the same particle system twice. We will offset both of them so they meet in the center, and the first frame and the last frame will be in the middle of the same particle system setup. So if we have 300 frames, for example, one of them starts from minus 150 to 150, and the other one will start from 150 to 450. So the frame 0 will be in the middle of the particle system, and the frame 300 will be exactly the same frame from the other duplicated particle system. So let's first set our particles to start from minus 150 to 150 frames with a 150 lifetime. Now just duplicate that particle system that we created. Make sure you click here to make it single user data so we can add the different settings or starting and ending frames. Offset the starting frame to start from 150 and the end frame to 450, and let's see what we have. Frame 150 is where they meet. And if we check what we have at the end and the beginning, on frame 0 and 300 we can see that we have the same thing, and that's what we need for a loop. So now if you want to change further some of the settings, you can just copy paste to the other particle system, or just delete the second one, adjust the first one as you wish, and then duplicate it one more time and set it with the start and ending frames like we just did. For the rendering, it's best if we can bake the particle system, so we don't have any issues when doing the render. Both of the particle systems, one by one. It might take a few minutes, I'm speeding up here. Before the final renders, I prefer to do a viewport animation first, to make sure everything works well. This is something like a fast test animation that we can do. So set the settings for MPEG-4 video with these settings. We can also set the resolution to 50%, just for the testing animation. Hit viewport render animation under the view. It will take again a few minutes. And we have this animation that we can use to precise the final animation. We can check if there are any issues, see how everything is coming together. Check also if it's looping properly. Here is the final animation scene, and a few things I touched after this test video. Let me show you what is it. So I linked the body material to the legs. I separated from the body material and changed the color ramp interpolation to B-spline to get this glowing effect there. Linked this material to the horns as well. For the spikes, I end up having different patterns with emission shaders. Like this one, just a simple material mixed with emission. For the emission, I'm using clear weight to make them more interesting, having this light dark gradienting. For these horns I added one more material with emission inside of the tubes. This is quite easy, just add one more material to the object, then in edit mode select the faces you want and assign the new material, then adjust it the way you want it. I added a wave modifier to the head curves, just to give them some motion. This is what we have using the wave, and here are the settings. To loop the wave modifier, I added a code to the speed values. Let me know in the comments if you need help with this. I also added one more cube there with a simple particle system, and I loop it like we just did, just to have some particles popping out of the head. But because this particle system is in motion, it's moving with the head. To loop it, I have to pair the cube to another empty and offset the empty constraint. We have the follow path constraint with a 0, 100 and 200 offset value frames. I added the 200 frames here, then I offset it there on minus 300 frame. The volume I put to 0.1, and that's basically everything I did for this animation. That's in the setting for the final rendering. I'm doing the render as separate PNG images, then go to the video editing tab where we can add this as image sequence. Add them on the first frame, adjust the output settings if needed, Ctrl F12 and we'll combine these images into animation in a few minutes. Now because we have all this stuff like particles, volumes and a lot of emission shaders and so on, the time for the rendering went up a lot. But if you have problem with that, your machine maybe is not fast enough or whatever is the case, you can actually use Google Co-op to do some free GPU rendering. You just have to download some code, upload your file to Google Drive and connect the things with a Google Co-op. It's tricky to set it at first, but once you do it, it can render for free. Now there are more things to do and I won't get into the details too much, but there are nice tutorials on YouTube that can guide you on how to do it if you need some extra rendering. If you want to get together multiple clips, you can obviously do it in Blender, but I prefer to do it in DaVinci Resolve, which is a great video editing software that you can use also for free. There is a paid and free version, but all you need is in the free version, so you can try in this one if you want. And with that being said, that's the final part of this Dragon series. I just wanted to follow up with this additional part and show you what you can do with this procedural thing. So if you're still watching, I want to thank you, hope you learned some, and I hope to see you on the next one.